Let's have a look at hazards and risks, a very important part of fitness instructor work. In this session we'll look at the following. So we'll describe the differences between a hazard and a risk. We'll identify common hazards that might occur in the fitness environment. We'll look at the risk assessment and the 5 steps that are involved in it, and we'll describe how to deal with common hazards and manage risk. In this section you might want to look at pages 9 onwards in the green section of your manual. So before we do that, have a think about what you think a hazard might be. Just pause this for a second, have a think. When you're ready you can unpause. So hazards are defined as a source of danger with the possibility of injury or harm. Employees should be fully briefed and trained to be constantly alert for hazards. If you remember from the last section, employees have a responsibility to act in a way that maintains everyone's health and safety. So if they spot something, they should act. It's one of the key parts of that law. It's essential for employers to carry out regular assessments of risks and ensure hazards are avoided. Okay, so there should be both a formal process where risks are assessed regularly, but also an informal process where if any hazards are seen, they should be dealt with. You can have a think about what common hazards you might see. So these might be the environment, the floor, the ceilings, etc. It might be the equipment if it's not well maintained or difficult to use or hasn't got guards, etc. Working practices of people, behaviour, and whether there are any hazardous substances. So you can see on page 9 in your green manual there are quite a few examples there you can look at, but just have a think. So from some of those hazards, can you think what you might do to minimise those? For example, so lack of ventilation is one of them in the facilities. So you can then provide ventilation, open windows, address the air conditioning, etc. You can do things like that to do it. Faulty wiring is an example of equipment. So obviously in the short term you can warn people away from anything that's connected to that wiring, and in the longer term you can get that fixed. So these are examples of how you might control the hazards. If you can't demonstrate you've controlled the hazards, you may be at risk of prosecution. So if we have a look at what a risk is, that's defined as the possibility of suffering injury, harm, loss or danger. It might sound quite similar to a hazard. The way you might want to think about it is the hazard is the thing and the risk is the result. So the hazard is the thing that might cause it, but the risk is what happens as a result of the thing. So it's like there's a slight difference. It's very subtle. So obviously when we do a risk assessment, it's the hazards that we look at and see if any of those hazards are likely to cause a significant risk. So it's essential for employers to carry out regular assessments of risk to ensure that hazards are avoided and injuries are prevented. So there are 5 steps to a risk assessment. So firstly, you identify the hazards. It's very important to do this systematically, go room by room, place by place, wall by wall, and looking at the examples of hazards on page 9, see any of those hazards that may be there. What you then got to do is say, right, if that hazard exists, who might be harmed by that and how? Because some things might be at risk more to children or older adults or people with conditions. Once you've identified that, you can say, right, what is the risk of that happening? We'll show those in a minute, but you decide on how likely and how severe the risks are, and then you can record the findings, implement any precautions that you've put in place, and then record that they've been done. So this is important that that's done. Once you've done that, review the assessment again, and then almost go back to the start. Are there still any hazards? Can we do further work to minimise those risks? So this is generally risk assessment. So you generally risk 1 to 5 on severity of likelihood. So you can see here's our severity scale. So here's our likelihood scale and here's our severity scale. And you multiply the two. Okay, so if you've decided if there's something wrong it's very unlikely to happen, a less than 2% chance of it happening, and if it does happen, you'd get a minor injury. All right, so you might get a cut on the hand or something. You would multiply 1 by 1, that would give you 1, and that would give you a low or acceptable risk. If, for example, there was some kind of trip hazard, most people would likely to avoid it, but if you did fall off it, you might endanger your ankle for some time. That might involve you being off work for 3 days, so you then multiply 1 by 3. This would give you a medium risk. You would need to have signage in there or rails or something to minimise the risk. This risk might go up if, let's say, you had lots of people who had visual impairments or were older or less able to deal with the uneven flooring. That would send the likelihood up, and that might take you into different risks. The moment you get above 11, you do need to make sure that it's stopped. You need to close down. That's seen as an intolerable risk. So you need to take action at that point. So there is a risk assessment on the highlighted hazards. You can have a look at those and follow the 5 steps to calculate the risk rating. Then have a look at how you could manage risk in the workplace, and then try and think of as many as possible. You'll see some examples then on page 13 in your green chapter. Okay, so when you've done that, there are some activities to do that will be assessed.